press and speak. That's it. And I think they're on a 2 or 3 chain. So the fourth one will switch off the first one. Do you know what I mean?
So you have 3 on
you'll
at
have
once.
more than 3 open. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. They've
today to have this evidence session, and of course to all of you for attending. St Catherine's has, through a gift from David Harding, who's an alumnus of the college, has established the BioRisk project, which you can see on these posters here. And this is a project which looks at bioengineering, invasive species, bioterrorism, and energy diversity. Somewhere. It's led by Professor Bill Sutherland, who's sat there, and Lord Brown of Ladyton, who is sat there. And this is part of a broader initiative that Lord Brown and I dreamt up in 2009 when I was a Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Defence. And this is a broader initiative to try and bring together science and policy in a more creative and informative and accessible way for the UK. So it's a great pleasure to have this committee here, and we look forward to a lively session. Thank you.
Right. Can everybody hear me? Do I need a mic? I need to.
Yeah, you need to speak into the mic.
This mic. So I need to stand at the.
It won't go onto the live stream.
Okay. Right. I'm going to. I'm at a fixed point, which is never good for me because I like to have a wander up and down. But welcome to everybody this morning for coming. My name's Mary Cray and I'm the chair of the committee. And can I begin by introducing the committee to you? To my left we have James Gray, MP for North Wiltshire. You are. I know you sat to my right, but you are definitely on my left at the moment. Anna McMorran, as you can tell, James is a Conservative MP, so our future is in his hands. We've got to be very, very nice to him. Who are you backing, James?
1 of 10 people.
Excellent. Good to know. Spoken like a true politician. Anna McMorran, MP for Cardiff North. Yep. This is going to really test my brain. Anna, welcome. You're very welcome here this morning. John McNally, MP for Falkirk, SNP MP. And the invisible person at the end is Alex Sobel, who is the MP for Leeds North West, who is getting a later train and joining us very shortly. But I wanted to use this opportunity to just say a little bit about what the committee does. I'm the Labour MP for Wakefield. I've been... literally, here is Alex Sobel, MP for Leeds North West. I want to just let you know what a select committee does and what our committee in particular has done. I'm going to start by plugging my podcast. I've got a podcast. It's quite good fun. And that's me before my breakfast. After my breakfast, everything's a lot better. But I started this podcast to try and let the wider world know about the brilliant work that the committee does and all the excellent scientists that we hear from, because not everyone has an hour and a half to come and sit through a select committee session or to follow the live stream. So we've got episodes on Brexit, also known as the B word, the Arctic, and fashion, our recent inquiry into fast fashion. We are releasing our inquiry into toxic chemicals on Friday to coincide with the 2nd anniversary of the Grenfell Tower disaster. We will be having episodes on planetary health, because everything we do to the Earth, we do to ourselves, and we're only really beginning to understand that. And we will have a podcast on invasive species when this inquiry has concluded. So the role and remit of the committee... I hope I'm not blinding anyone with the laser beam there. I'm pressing the wrong button. What do you have to point it at? The right button, OK. I'm not used to pressing the right button. We are a cross-departmental group of MPs. We look at what government policy is to protect the environment. We hear evidence, we report, and then the government has 2 months to respond to our recommendations. But what we also do is look at what the government does as the largest purchaser of goods and services in the country. Because when the NHS decides to purchase electric vehicles, it will be a game changer for the electric vehicle second-hand market in this country. And so far, we've been quite critical about their decisions to delay and and sort of procrastinate around that. So, for example, the NHS has a budget of £127 billion. Its GDP is equivalent to Cambodia and Croatia's combined. So when the Paris framework was agreed, Cambodia and Croatia were there saying what they were going to do to cut their climate emissions, but the NHS was absent. So in a way, as well as keeping the UK honest on its promises, we're also trying to make sure that the NHS and all those other big spending government departments do the right thing by our climate. You may have noticed we're in the longest parliamentary session for 200 years. We are debating the Sustainable Development Goals in Parliament today, but select committees have a very important role when we have a essentially minority government that is very prone to the whims of MPs and what they decide is or isn't important, which is good news for us. Everything that we look at is done in the framework of those Sustainable Development Goals, those 17 goals that the government signed up to at the United Nations to transform the world by 2030. They're the plan to end poverty, violence and hunger in every country in the world. So not just the least developed countries, not just poorer countries, but in our own country as well. And obviously when we read stories of toddlers being murdered by their parents, when we think about some of the issues that are facing us with knife crime, we really need to get working on this because we only really have 10 years to meet these goals. So what does ending poverty and violence and hunger look like in our country? The government is about to present its voluntary national review to the United Nations in July, and we have monitored that process, and I think it's fair to say we've been quite critical of it. But there will be a debate this afternoon, which we'll be rushing back for. I put those jokers up there. Now, everybody knows who they are. I hope they do. Maybe you don't know who Jeff Bezos is. He's quite funny. But basically, we're in a funny populist space at the moment. And we've got Donald Trump, who was visiting last year. And Samart told me, as we were chatting beforehand, you know, Trump might believe that global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. But that hasn't stopped him applying to build a seawall to protect his golf course in Ireland from rising seas. So one rule at home, Donald, one rule abroad. So it's interesting, isn't it? Whose voice gets heard and, you know, who captures public attention. And Jeff Bezos, he's going to try and put people on the moon. I think it would be better to just sort out the problems we have here on Earth. The richest man on the planet, his business model, we found out a couple of weeks ago, is about throwing smart TVs into landfill because it's cheaper than sending them back to their suppliers. So what does it mean when a consumption-fueled society makes things that are never used, never sold, and go straight to landfill? How is that resource efficient? And how come he's the richest man in the world? How come we've got a tax system and an economic system that lets him get away with that? And isn't it interesting how Mrs. Bezos has decided to spend her money while he's hoarding his? Just a little joke for the ladies there. So, other voices that we'd like to hear from. We had Greta Thunberg in Parliament, and in her speech, this 16-year-old young woman, said, "We had everything we could ever wish for, yet now we may have nothing." Very profound moment for Parliament. And as a result of that and her appearance and the school strikes, we have declared a climate emergency in Parliament. We know that species loss is happening at a faster rate, at the fastest rate since the dinosaurs went extinct, and we've seen, you know, killer heat waves last year. So we are living in very interesting, difficult, dangerous times, and I see the role of our committee, we're all passionate about the environment, is to make sure that the voices of our children and your voice is being heard amongst the populist clamour that is online, on TV and on Facebook. We started back in 2016 with our report into microbeads, where we said there's no reason for these tiny plastic particles to be in wash-off products, and as a result the government banned them, the first country in the EU to ban them, so pat on the back for the government there. We did a report in 2017 into plastic bottles and coffee cups. I was delighted as we got off the train at Cambridge to see there's a refill point there. I said we did that. Because we did. We got the country talking about it. But here's what we're up against. 2 trillion drinks containers used globally every year. What happens to them? Tiny proportion of those are ever recycled. And we know here in the UK, 15 million plastic bottles a day landfilled, littered or incinerated. So we can't wait till 2023 for that deposit return scheme. We need, to follow the actions of Scotland, as my colleague John McNally would say, and get on with it. We're a great country. There's nothing stopping us doing it apart from, inertia and vested interests. 2018, we did a report into green finance because, of course, where money goes, governments will follow. And we know that the financial system has a tendency to short-term thinking. The risk from climate is not factored in to the investment decisions that are being made in the city. The risks are physical risks from floods, droughts, rising sea levels and big insurance claims. Transitional risks from stranded assets from oil and gas, so people investing in fossil fuels and then finding out that they can never be burned. And liability risks where communities, which we've seen in the States, are suing fossil fuel companies for the floods and damage that have been caused. So we pushed the government to mandate that all pension accounts should report their climate risks, and that has now happened. So slowly, under the radar, we are changing the way that the city thinks about climate risk. And it was good to see the Chancellor this week announcing how are we going to decarbonise the UK economy. So if any of you have any ideas on that, do go and have a look on the Treasury website. We also did a report into fashion. Globally, textile production is one of the most polluting industries, producing 1.2 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent each year. More emissions than international flights and shipping put together. If you look across the full life cycle of clothing, the global fashion industry has an annual carbon footprint of 3.3 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. Some parts of the fashion industry are making real strides in reducing their impact on the planet, but this is being outweighed by the amount of clothing they produce, roughly doubling over the last 15 years. The fashion industry has been marking its own homework for far too long. We need to change the law to fix fashion. You'll have noticed that I'm wearing exactly the same clothes today that I was wearing in that video. I was like, oh my God, but I have got a different brooch on. So I haven't been sleeping in them for the last 3 months. But it has really profoundly changed the way I know many of our committee, I think 3 of our committee staff are having a year without buying fashion and a year without buying shoes. So it's really changed the way that we think about things. We buy twice as many clothes as the stylish Italians. I know the men are all like, yeah, we only have 2 suits anyway. But there is an issue about pick, click and bin. And we need to rein in those impulses, not least because they're getting people into debt and they're making people unhappy as well. So the average piece of clothing is worn just 7 times, and we throw 11 million items of clothing in the bin in this country each year. 140 million pounds of stuff that's been grown in water-scarce companies, literally going into the trash, sometimes without us taking the tags off it. So we really need to think about what does a world where everybody has decent clothes to wear look like? And of course, the plastic microfibres that are coming off our acrylic jumpers, and the Rana Plaza disaster where over 1,100 garment workers were killed when that factory collapsed 5 years ago in Bangladesh, making clothes, amongst others, for Primark on our high street. What's the real cost of a £2 t-shirt? Because whatever it is, we aren't paying it. So they're just some of the many subjects that we have covered. You'll have the Twitter feed, you'll have the hashtags. If you want to follow us, we're at Commons EAC. You can follow me on Facebook if you want to know more about Wakefield. I do some of our fashion and climate stuff on there. And you can follow all of us on our Twitter hashtags. So I'll leave it there, and we are going to now start the session. That means we're officially in business. Can I begin by welcoming our guests to our second external session? Our first one was at the Victoria and Albert Museum about fashion. And can I ask you to introduce yourselves, starting from my left, please?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Dr. Mark Belchet from representing the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, but I am actually based here at Cambridge at the British Antarctic Survey. It's probably quite a long way to get here for the rest of my colleagues who are actually based down in Stanley in the Falkland Islands.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Kevin Hughes, and I am from the British Antarctic Survey, where I am the Environmental Research and Monitoring Manager, and I lead on biosecurity.
Good morning. My name is Catherine Wensink. I'm from the UK Overseas Territories Conservation Forum. We're a UK-based NGO. We've been in existence for about 30 years, and we work with non-governments and governments in the overseas territories to protect their biodiversity.
And my name is Jonathan Hall. I'm head of the UK Overseas Territories team at the RSPB.
Thank you very much. You're all very welcome. Can I start with a question to you, Miss Wensink? Can you just kick off by telling us what you think are the biggest challenges facing from invasive species in the UK's overseas territories, please?
Thank you. I would say some of the biggest challenges are the increased rates of introductions from invasive species. We've seen some incredible work from the GB non-native secretariat in looking at horizon scanning, and that's thrown up all sorts of potential introductions in the overseas territories. Most of the territories are small islands with small populations, small economies. So there's often lacking technical expertise to make decisions on forward planning in terms of invasive species. There's also resource issues with funding. The overseas territories are not able to access many funding streams because of their relationship with the UK, this unique relationship. So they have very few funds in which to be able to access. And obviously, big projects involving invasive species cost a lot of money. Also, potentially the lack of legal assistance in developing legislation and regulations, because a lot of these are needed in the overseas territories, and that's obviously quite a big issue for some of the overseas territories as well.
Can you tell us, when you say an increasing rate, what's it gone from and to? Is it increasing exponentially, logarithmically? Has it gone from 1 to 2, 1 to 10? Can you talk us through the numbers?
Sure. Well, I wouldn't be able to put an exact figure on that, but I would say that many of the overseas territories are still lacking sufficient infrastructure. And, once those projects take place, for example, in Montserrat, I think it was about 15 years ago, they had a new airport. And during building the new airport, an invasive species from Antigua was brought in, which was the fire ant. That's a very bad invasive species. And in terms of those rates of invasion, infrastructure projects are one of many things that can bring in new invasive species. For example, Ascension Island is having some work on the runway at the moment, and that's linking with the US counterparts. And obviously, that's the potential to bring in invasive species on that is obviously huge. But I don't think anybody can put a figure on that. I mean, I know some of the horizon scanning workshops have identified what potential species could come in, but I don't think they've got to looking at this rate of invasion yet.
Okay, give us 10 seconds on why the fire ant is bad.
Okay, I can tell you firsthand, I've been stung by fire ants. It's very, very painful. This was in the school on Montserrat. There was actually a colony when we were doing a site visit. They're a big problem in the US. They can get into electrical generators, and apparently they really enjoy building their their colonies, their nests in there. So there's a huge economic consideration as well to have. But also, I know, visiting with colleagues from Ascension, that they're a real worry about invading turtle nesting sites. So obviously that has the potential to really impact some of our territories, which are really, really important for many species, not just the turtles. So.
You talked about the legislation aspects. What laws do they need?
I couldn't. Don't know if anyone else can answer that question directly. Maybe Jonathan. I don't know.
Who would like to answer? Yeah, Jonathan.
So there's a very diverse range of kind of legal situations across the territories, but to our assessment, certainly the majority either lack any biosecurity legislation at all or have sort of very old legislation, mostly done for agricultural health purposes, perhaps 50, 60 years ago. So there is, for the people on the front line trying to prevent new arrivals, they're both not backed up by legislation or any kind of enforcement powers or preventative measures that they can legally take, and then they just have lack of people to implement what legislation and policies are in place. So it might be, for example, on Ascension, where there is a risk of fire ants and malaria-bearing mosquitoes recently highlighted. There's no legislation in place as yet, though there is work underway. And then there's one part-time biosecurity officer trying to make sure that this biodiversity hotspot doesn't have new arrivals with significant negative impacts.
As far as you're aware, when you do an environmental impact assessment, are environmental impact assessments done for these runways that the British government is funding? Is that something we should ask ministers?
So I believe that has been done for the Ascension project, though there isn't any environmental impact assessment legislation or requirements from Ascension's itself. So this is where there's the reliance on the US and the UK government adopting a best practice which isn't necessarily legally required in a territory which has very few laws in place. So that's where the tension can be found. So they're re-tendering for the major Ascension airport resurfacing project at the moment after, I believe, having an unsuccessful tender round. And therefore, in the re-tendering process, there is perhaps a pressure to look at what extra requirements on the contractors could be cut or made less onerous. And so that's where certainly the original commitment to having best practice biosecurity on such a project must be maintained.
Is that not the airport that's just been finished?
So that's on St. Helena. So that was, and that is just interesting, worth mentioning that there are at least 2 or 3 new invasive plant species that airport project, which was actually DFID funded, is believed to have introduced. But the Ascension Airport resurfacing project is being led, I believe, by the US government, but with Ministry of Defence funding and partial oversight, as it's a very complicated shared airport runway complex.
Very briefly, the 2 things you mentioned with regard to Ascension Island, namely the fire ants and the malaria-bearing mosquitoes, how did they get there?
So neither are there as yet. Both have been identified as key threats in this horizon scanning process led by the UK government. Tramp ants are often referred to as sort of tramp ants because they have been so effective at spreading around many islands around the world. Equipment is one of the most common methods, so bringing in sort of diggers or JCBs, and tyres are famous transporters of mosquitoes with little areas of water in them. In one sort of thing to perhaps bring this to life, in 2016 an assessment was done of US cargo being brought into the US base on Ascension, and they found over 50% of the containers inspected contained live invertebrates. There were also live geckos and dead frogs by the time that they were found. So one of the key links for Ascension on risk is from the US, is the resupplies coming from Florida, and so a much more of a similar environmental context than bringing in something from Falklands.
So improved biosecurity now could stop it?
Yes, absolutely. So that's where prevention is so much cheaper than cure. There is work underway supported by the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat to try and help Ascension introduce biosecurity legislation. We're actually part funding the biosecurity officer in the Ascension Island government. But this is a sort of very small island jurisdiction, 750 people, and severe vulnerability.
Thank you. Dr. Belcher, what capacity do the UK overseas territory governments have for dealing with these invasive species when they get there, and what needs to improve?
I think it probably varies greatly across the different territories, and I think South Georgia is probably at the other end of the scale to some of the ones that we've heard about, in that I think our concerns vary slightly in that we've had a number of very successful programs of eradication, and so now we're probably more concerned with ensuring that the islands of South Georgia remain free of those previously invasive species, but also aware that under changing climate conditions that there may well be new pathways for introduction, particularly of marine species, to South Georgia. We're also very lucky in that we don't have a native population or any population at all, just visiting scientists and government officers. And we do generate revenue through the sale of fishing licenses within the territory, and a very large percentage of the revenue from fishing licenses is put back into environmental protection. So we have very strict laws on biosecurity, both in the marine environment and through tourist activities in the terrestrial environment. But I think we are very, very different to some of the other territories.
Is the UK government doing enough to support the overseas territories?
So I can't really speak for the territories other than the British Antarctic Territory. But what I would say is that due to the very, very strict legislation which prohibits the introduction of any non-native species into British Antarctic Territory and Antarctica as a whole, we have to be extremely careful and extremely vigilant in all of our practices. So the UK is undergoing a period of modernisation of its infrastructure in Antarctica, particularly with the arrival of the RRS Sir David Attenborough, and that has caused us to have infrastructure projects such as the development of new wharves and new buildings, which is very good because we get to put in good biosecurity facilities in our stations. But we are spending a reasonably large proportion of those budgets on biosecurity practices. So if I look at some of the numbers, we're putting a new wharf in at Rothera Research Station in BAT, and we have spent over £400,000 on biosecurity practices. And that's through our contractors, BAM, Nuttall. So an example would be we imported 4,500 tons of cargo into Antarctica to do that project. And we found that we had 44 minor biosecurity breaches once we'd done all of the biosecurity practices. And those were picked up just before that equipment was offloaded. So that's one biosecurity breach per 100,000, or sorry, per 100 tons of cargo, which I think is extremely good.
And what's the total cost of that wharf building project? 400,000 out of what?
So that was 39 million. So I think across all of our different projects, it's between 1 to 1.5% of our budget is on biosecurity.
Thank you all very much indeed. We've got a question now from John.
Thank you, Chair. Basically, my questions are on funding for the overseas territories, and principally to Mr Hall and Ms Wensink. So, given that prevention is more cost-effective than eradication and control, as you've just probably mentioned, an ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure, how effectively are government funds being spent on projects in the overseas territories?
I would say that perhaps from the work of the committee previously, the spend on Darwin Plus, which is the only government funding stream which is solely for the overseas territories, we've seen an increase from about 3 million in round 6, which was 2018, to about 4 million in 2018. However, you know, we've seen that, you know, the cost of getting rid of an invasive species once it's become established are huge sums of money. And the Darwin Plus has so many priorities that it's hoping to deliver. There's such broad themes in terms of the environment. Invasive species is just one of them. The others are delivering on the blue belt, conservation and management of coral reefs and seagrasses, waste management, particularly plastics, mitigating against impacts of natural disasters. That's, again, a huge undertaking. Implementing national biodiversity action plans and conservation and restoration of wise use of wetlands. Again, you know, those can be quite large projects. So I would say that it's trying to do a lot of stuff with perhaps, you know, not a huge amount of money. And, you know, we would always call for that to be, always,
So Darwin Plus is the only project funding for territory organisations, and then there has been this 4-year project that the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat has been running. It's only costing 1.25 million, but it's been brilliant at bringing together UK government expertise and making it available to the territories for prevention. It's not working on the cure side at all. And that has identified these high-risk species, as mentioned. It's identified the key pathways. And I think most brilliantly, it's also actually drafted model biosecurity legislation for these small jurisdictions and has money in it for legal capacity to work with their often very overstretched Attorney General's offices to actually help implement these laws, because there have been previous examples of draft bills made and there's simply not been the capacity to pass them. So I would say that this is a really good spend of money. The kick in the teeth is that it all expires, of course, in March at the end of this financial year, and there is quite simply no way that all the follow-up from having identified these high-risk species, these key pathways, and starting to work with these the Attorney General offices will be complete. So to my mind, an extension of that funding to make sure that this programme actually completes its kind of step change in biosecurity across the territories is really essential.
Could I follow up then? You've just mentioned that there's a huge broad spectrum of things that you need to have to target along here, and it seems very wide. And some of the things you've mentioned already, I mean, you've got the brain worrying about how you're going to cope with this. So that brings me on to my point. Should there be a specific funding source for dealing with invasive species prevention? Could you make it really specific so that the control in the overseas territories would have that particular type of funding, since it is the biggest threat to biodiversity in these areas? Can you understand what I'm saying there?
Yeah, no, of course. I think it's worth saying that it's very easy to measure the impact of a project which has eradicated something, and perhaps there's maybe something in that in terms of the political buy-in to have projects whereby you're preventing invasive species from becoming established. And that would be the first thing that sprung to my mind. Something I forgot to mention was about EU funding as well. So from 2014 to 2019, the EU BEST fund supported €10 million worth of projects in the EU overseas territories, which has a question mark over it now. So. Yeah, I would say obviously, we heard in the other evidence sessions that you had from the experts that prevention is far better than eradicating something once it's become established. But I guess it's how you get the backing to be able to do this prevention work, which perhaps isn't as to use the word sexy, I don't know, in terms of, funding projects and these, massive conservation wins that we're seeing in terms of South Georgia and, potentially others as well.
Yeah, you bring me on nicely to my last point, and importantly, it is topical at the moment with the B word, as was mentioned earlier, and there is a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen. So how would you say, how reliant are the UK overseas territories on EU funding for these invasive species projects? How important is this funding? Because we're not going to really get a second chance at this, I don't think, unless we make this everybody aware of it. And from the evidence we've heard, and even this morning talking to some of the people here, that people don't seem to be aware of the real problem. So how do we get that message out there?
So over the past decade, the RSV has been able to utilise €2.5 million of European Union funding on invasive species projects, both biosecurity and response in the overseas territories. And so I would say there is very significant reliance on EU funding as one of the very few other areas of support. The territories are ineligible for most UK domestic sources, they're ineligible for most international funding sources, and so... So they sort of fall between the stools. So from a UK perspective, the Heritage Lottery Fund funds a lot of major environmental projects, but they're not deemed part of the UK for that perspective. They're deemed sort of international. The Global Environment Facility will fund major international projects, and whilst many of these territories will have all the statistics to be a small island developing state, they don't qualify for this funding because they're deemed part of the UK and therefore in the developed category. So they're sort of stuck with very few funding sources, and so the EU BEST has been a really vital source of funding. And just sort of one other point on funding, if I may, but the Darwin Plus as this dedicated fund has been fantastic for the territories, but is basically capped at projects around £300,000 in size. And there was a study earlier in this year which identified the top 200 islands around the world for invasive mammal eradications, such as the rats and the great work on South Georgia. And certainly 20 of those islands of the top 300, worldwide, are in the UK overseas territories, and of the top 10, only one of those could be funded from Darwin Plus. Most of the rest would cost in the millions. So a project fund is also needed that could fund larger scale projects for these big restoration projects to deal with invasive species which have arrived, and fund the sort of 1 to 5 million projects as EU Life was doing. And ironically, EU Life is just being opened up to the overseas territories in the next funding round to come in current EU budgetary discussions. So there is, just to link back to the EU there is that need for an equivalent of the life scale funding as well as the smaller BEST project funding.
Supplementary from James.
Dr. Halls just touched on this. Would you not agree with me, or the whole panel perhaps, there are two quite separate things here. One is biodiversity protection, which is an ongoing revenue-funded thing, which we have to find a way of paying for out of annual accounts, and invasive species eradication, of which the biggest example is, of course, South Georgia, £10 million, entirely, or very largely privately funded by the South Georgia Heritage Trust, paid for by a Swedish billionaire. So there's a difference here. These huge projects that cost an enormous amount of money are very important, but we are unlikely to find real funds for them, whereas ongoing everyday biosecurity in the overseas territories is something we ought to be able to find funds for from ordinary revenue accounts. Is that a reasonable summary?
I think that would be a fantastic idea. Just to say, I think we need a range of projects as well, from these small project funds where the NGOs are able to bring in volunteers and to really add pound for pound on that investment, but also the large funds as well. We spoke before about the Dutch postcode lottery. They give large amounts of money for dream projects. Now, a lot of these eradication projects are probably dream projects that on the ground workers would really want to do if they had the money to do them. So in terms of, you know, the ongoing support that you were talking about, yes, I think absolutely. But I think we also need room to have these dream projects become a reality.
Short follow-up from me. I mean, can you just explain how I tell my Wakefield constituents why they're working 3 jobs to fund eradication projects or biosecurity in British Virgin Islands, which doesn't collect taxes from its own citizens and is a haven for tax avoidance? What's the argument there?
Great question.
Maybe I should save that one for the minister. I mean, it's a naughty one, but
it is.
But you know, seriously, why are they working 3 jobs to fund Bermuda tax haven, BVI tax haven, and Lord Ashcroft's, private jets? I mean, there are a lot of wealthy individuals.
Well, it all comes down to language, I think.
I'm doing it. I'm exaggerating for emphasis.
And I think it's a shame when we talk about the overseas territories. In terms of financial services, we label them as tax havens. But then when we're talking about this global biodiversity, which we have an international obligation to meet the targets, the Aichi targets, the Sustainable Development Goals, the UK signs the Convention on Biological Diversity and on behalf of the overseas territories. So it's kind of it's a moral responsibility for the UK to support hand in hand the overseas territories, because they really can't do it on their own. It needs to be a partnership, and that's kind of we've left our mark on the world in terms of invasive species, introduced species, for example, St Helena, the flax that was planted for the Royal Mail postage sacks, the ties on the sacks, that's still there now. That's a legacy that the Royal Mail has left behind, and we have a moral responsibility to help.
Okay, we'll see if we get as good an answer as that from the ministers, but thank you. That was great. Alex.
So just following up from Mary's questions, really, question 1. So in Mr Hall's evidence, you said that 94% of the UK's biodiversity was in the UK overseas territories, making it hugely internationally significant, our contribution to biodiversity in the overseas territories. So where are the biggest weaknesses in biosecurity in the overseas territories, and where should we concentrate our fire in terms of legislation and the need to legislate to ensure that we keep that level of biodiversity in the overseas territories? So maybe Mr Hall could start, and then Dr Belcher could add anything he would like to add.
So it's the more remote and oceanic islands, in particular of the South Atlantic, Pacific and Indian Ocean, which have been the biggest sort of crucibles of evolution and have the highest levels of unique species on them, and are also combined with having the lowest GDP per capita and the smallest population sizes. So for me, the support to these territories is particularly essential, and these are the ones which in particular don't have those biosecurity frameworks in place, don't have anyone to actually enforce anything if it is in place very frequently, and are very proud of their amazing wildlife, very keen to see it protected, and often feel struggle with the frustration of not necessarily being able to protect their island environments as much as they would like, and reliant, for instance, on the ports in South Africa to actually ensure that species aren't getting onto boats coming to them with their vital supplies. So there is a lot of support, I think, that could be done there in a very cost-effective manner, and these territories also have some of the most iconic species that are loved by your constituents, in terms of vast numbers of penguins or turtles or other iconic species that really chime with the UK public.
I think one of the issues that we have is certainly in the South Atlantic OTs, a very small number of staff. Probably South Georgia government has a maximum of 8 people, without necessarily the specialist skills to be experts across all facets of biosecurity. we're very, very lucky in having very close partnerships with the British Antarctic Survey to draw on that expertise. But that access probably isn't available to other OTs to draw on similar expertise based elsewhere. And I also think something that perhaps Jonathan touched on as well is that when biosecurity issues arise within your territory, it's probably a little too late. And I think being able to move the border further back in the process. So for South Georgia, as an example, we have a large number of tourist vessels visiting, scientists visiting, and fishing vessels. Ensuring that biosecurity is undertaken at ports of exit before they even enter our maritime zone is far more effective than having to do that work at South Georgia itself, where resources and the infrastructure just don't exist.
I would just add that obviously, with Planet Earth and the Blue Planet, everybody, is just absolutely fascinated about the natural world, and I think now's the time for this easy sell of conservation wins, and there's so much innovation that can be done in the overseas territories to help the UK as well in dealing with invasive species, because we're talking about small islands where the scaling ups could be potentially very powerful for the UK as well. Just to mention the conservation dogs that have been working on South Georgia, I mean, that's just a fantastic story that the UK should know about, because everybody loves dogs, don't they? And if they can help with dealing with invasive species, then and rodents, and there's all sorts of other species that can be have a wider application. And also in the other evidence session, you mentioned environmental DNA, that processing of looking at marine invasive species. Well, that's something that potentially could be very interesting to trial in some of the overseas territories and have an application back home in the UK.
Obviously, we're in a world where we're constantly talking about customs and border checks and their future policy. Is this an area for either, depending if we keep our current status, the EU to look at, because obviously many EU countries have overseas territories like the UK, or in a post-Brexit Britain, that we should build into our trading negotiations with these countries in terms of protecting the biodiversity in overseas territories and points of origin for goods and for people in those countries when we come to sign new trade agreements?
I mean, I think that, speaking for the Caribbean, there's an awful lot of goodwill between the French territories and the Dutch territories, which, is there already. And obviously this cooperation regionally to pool resources and expertise is happening, and, more potentially more could be encouraged by the UK. And I don't really know what the outlook is for that cooperation post EU, but I would say that the French and Dutch territories, particularly in the Caribbean, would be obviously wanting to cooperate as much as possible.
Maybe that's one for the ministers as well. So in answer to Mary's question, you touched upon some projects which have been completed or well in process. So the airport at St Helena, the wharf project in the Antarctic, and then we've got new projects coming on stream, the airport in the Ascension Islands and the wharf in South Georgia, which is to accommodate the British Antarctic Survey vessel, the St David Attenborough, which I'm sure we're all very proud of. So what should the UK government do to minimise biosecurity risks in those projects, and what lessons have we learned from those projects that have already been completed in terms of what the UK government can do and how they can support the UK overseas territories in ensuring that we don't have those invasive species and we minimise the risks of biosecurity?
So, from previous experience, we, within the British Antarctic Survey and the projects that we've been involved in, have already invested a lot of effort in minimising the impacts of non-native species and importation through very strict biosecurity practices. It makes sense that should continue in projects outside BAT as well and other OTs. And also that we recognise that, for example, in the KP wharf, that we put in biosecurity practices along the whole of the supply chain from the UK through the Falkland Islands all the way through to South Georgia. And that's what we're trying to do, and we're investing as I said earlier, a reasonably large proportion of our budget in ensuring that happens. But that has to be recognised as a cost for any infrastructure project.
Dr. Belcher, do you want to come in on this one? Or?
No, I defer to Kev's expertise, as he's been very heavily involved in the development of the environmental impact assessment for the whole South Georgia KP Wharf project. I would say that we, as part of our legislation, which is the Wildlife and Protected Areas legislation at South Georgia, we have, it's necessary for anyone doing any type of project, whether it's a tiny scientific project or a large, relatively large infrastructure project, to consider the restricted activity permitting system that we have in place. So that hopefully puts in place an ability to capture any activity. Obviously the wharf development is rather at the large end of the scale to what we're usually dealing with, but even a small field party going to do work at South Georgia would have to fill in this restricted activity permit that covers explicitly potential biosecurity issues as well.
Catherine Wensink touched on this in terms of communications between different neighbouring territories. In particular, if a new threat is discovered in one territory, how is communication undertaken currently, and how could that be improved? And should this be something that's led by the territories themselves, considering the resource constraints? You know, I take on board what Dr. Belcher said before about the number of staff that they have, or should this be led by the UK government and the other, obviously, the other European overseas territories governments?
So different territories have sort of closer links to some than others, and I think there is certainly good communications between some of those territories about new emerging risks, especially when they share transport pathways. I think we come back to the capacity issue, however, that it may be the same person who is responsible for the whole gamut of an environment department, who is also meant to sometimes go and do the sort of biosecurity checks. And so whilst mechanisms to further improve communications would also always be welcome, for me it comes back down more to the actual capacity in the first place to find a sustainable model of biosecurity that is deliverable by a small community, but also mitigates enough of the worst risks.
I would just add that these emerging threats are coming up all the time. There's been one recently in the Turks and Caicos Islands of stony coral tissue loss disease, which we don't really know much about it, but we know that it's absolutely devastating to coral reefs. But I think it's only come about because they're actually seeing it happen and then looking to see, where has it come from. So I think they think it's originated in Florida. But I think there can be, more of this sharing of these emerging threats. And I mean, I know that the GB Non-Native Secretariat have done a really good job of building a network and, supplying information. But I think, that's something that's really, really important.
Just finally, obviously there's very clearly very limited human resources to deal with this in the overseas territories. What role could technology play to improve the biosecurity?
Well, I think the bottom line is that you just need people on the ground doing checks, just being there, using their eyes, looking for non-native species. Just it takes people, it takes time. It's hard to see how additional technologies can help with that.
I thought Wi-Fi worked really well down in the Antarctic.
Sorry.
I thought the Wi-Fi was really good down in the Antarctic.
That's one. Yeah, okay, that's one thing. But in terms of actually biosecurity checks, other than say perhaps ballast
Nothing
water
beats
as an
eyes and
exception.
ears. Yeah. Okay. We're going to move on with some questions on the polar regions from Anna.
Thank you. So just turning specifically to polar regions and looking at the unique risk of invasive non-native species poses for that area. What impact will increased ship traffic have on specifically the biosecurity of the polar regions and that area. We know that it's increased. I think it was reported that it was increased something like tenfold since the 1960s. So with that, could you comment on how that impacts that area?
So you're right, yes. Antarctica is hugely isolated. It's been only had people really visiting it for the last 200 years. So it's one of the very few areas of the world which actually hasn't been impacted by non-native and invasive species yet. And under the Antarctic Treaty, we're obliged to try and keep it like that and prevent non-natives getting in. One of the issues is, particularly with ships, is that we have the opportunity for the introduction of species on hulls through hull filing, and also in ballast water. We have got some reasonably good legislation in place. For example, the UK put forward legislation on ballast water guidelines back in 2006, which were endorsed by the Antarctic Treaty parties, and they entered into force. We've also got IMO guidelines on ballast water as well, which have come fully into force in 2017, so that's great. We think the bigger threat is probably to do with hull filing, and in some respects, Antarctica has a natural barrier, and that the sea ice that forms around the continent actually scrapes off some of the organisms that are stuck to the hull. The problem is with climate change that sea ice is declining, particularly on the western side of the Antarctic peninsula, which is within BAT. And actually that's where most of the tourist ships, most of the national operators with their research stations are located. So that really does present a particular problem, that things are much more likely to get in the future. Whether they can actually establish once they arrive is a different question, because the water is very cold, but we are expecting a sort of a 1 degree increase in temperature in the next 100 years, which would make establishment easier.
And of course, those species that do survive are likely to be those invasive species that could take hold. Would that be right? Is there a link to which species do survive? Yeah, so often it's kind of what we'd call weedy species, the ones which are very adaptable, which are able to, which are the invasive ones, which are able to colonize and spread. The other issue is a lot of the vessels that are entering Antarctica are actually coming from the Arctic, potentially. They're cruise ships that operate at both ends of the pole. There are national operator vessels that operate at both ends. And if those species can be transferred down to the Antarctic and to BAT, there is real potential for colonization and impacts on the native species. So what can be done to limit that? So we're really at the early stages of research into marine species, and there's an awful lot to do. In terms of limiting it, we already have the legislation that I mentioned earlier. I think it's probably too early to come up with practical or more practical solutions, because we just don't have a really good feel about what the numbers of species coming in, the types of species that are coming in. We just need a bit more research to help answer that question. And how do you, in terms of how the UK is managing the biosecurity risks in, I suppose, Antarctica and also the wider sub-Antarctic region, how do you feel, I mean, just drawing on the previous questions, how do you feel specifically in that area the UK is managing its approach? So I think both within South Georgia and BAT and through the work of BAS and the South Georgia government, we have a slightly different legislative regime, in that we don't want any non-native species being brought in at all. And it's very, very strict. And as a result of that, we need to comply with UK legislation, which is the Antarctic Act, and South Georgia legislation. So we put in place really strict biosecurity practices. The last thing that we want to do is introduce a rodent to South Georgia or a non-native plant to the British Antarctic Territory. So we undergo intense levels of training for everyone who goes to Antarctica. We have biosecurity checks when people are going in. If you have to watch a biosecurity video, if you get on the airplane to go to Rothera, if you go to our Antarctic station, or if you go on our ships, you get biosecurity training. It's really, really thorough, and we put a lot of effort and a lot of time into that. Dr. Belcher, would you like to comment on those questions?
Yeah, I mean, South Georgia is almost getting back to a situation that the sort of Antarctic has never, or it's never been challenged. So we're getting back to sort of a native environment with sort of the ecological restoration that's gone on. So I think the challenges are very, very similar at South Georgia to those faced in the Antarctic. And it is, we share, not only do we share a building, we share a lot of information. But the Antarctic Treaty System and the Committee for Environmental Protection within the Antarctic Treaty is really at the forefront of biosecurity, and the UK is a major player within that. And I'd like to think that a lot of that legislation and ideas that result from the CEP would get transferred to South Georgia quite easily. I'm not sure that's necessarily the case amongst some of the other OTs that can take on board those things quite as easily as we could.
And of course, with the Antarctic Treaty having, I think, 54 signatories, so how effective is multinational collaboration in the Antarctic on invasive species?
So as Mark mentioned, the Antarctic Treaty Systems Committee for Environmental Protection is the body which provides advice on environmental issues to the Antarctic Treaty parties. And it has placed non-native species issues at the top priority for its work looking forward. It's in its climate change response work programme. It's also in its 5-year work plan. But also internationally, we've got the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programmes, which kind of pulls together all the different parties who have research stations in Antarctica. And they have developed checklists and guidelines for how you basically do biosecurity in Antarctica. And also the Scientific Committee for Antarctic Research, which represents all of the scientists who are working in Antarctica. They have also produced codes of conduct to show how to reduce the potential risks of introductions of non-native species into subglacial environments, geothermal environments, terrestrial environments. So there's a lot of information out there. What perhaps we don't have is a really strong feel of how much that's been taken up and implemented by the parties. So we're working with ComNap at the moment to try and see if we can get another survey. There was a survey done about 12 years ago. We want another survey to see, well, how much biosecurity practices have been put in place and how well is everybody doing, and are there opportunities for improvement?
Would you say that's a real level of concern at the moment then, in terms of collaboration and an understanding of what everybody else is doing, essentially?
So I think there's a lot of discussion about non-native species, but I think the evidence to show us the level of biosecurity implementation is not there, and that's a particular concern for BAT because we've got roughly 18 other national operators working within that territory. So to have a handle on how much they're doing would be really helpful, because we are certainly doing an awful lot.
So what could the UK government be doing to help support that?
So we don't have any direct jurisdiction over those other national parties due to the Antarctic Treaty, but we can certainly show leadership within the Committee for Environmental Protection, and we convene the climate change response work, or the subsidiary group on climate change response, and we've led on the revision of the CEP non-native species manual. There's almost like a joke that the non-native species issue is the UK's agenda item at the meeting. So we're certainly doing our part there. We can also do some really good quality research, and British Antarctic Survey has produced over 50 papers on non-native species, and we feed that research into the policy environment. So for example, we've got a paper on inter-regional transfer of species going into the CEP this year, and also another paper on marine invasions. And also we have developed internationally a non-native species response protocol with Argentina, Spain, France and New Zealand, which we're pushing through the system.
I suppose the difficulty is you're talking about the economy, travel and tourism with some of these countries, and then the discussions on biosecurity, and it's whether the UK government is doing enough in raising that to bring those issues together in the right multilateral platforms that they can and where they can.
So Antarctica has its own legal framework, its own it's kind of separate from the rest of the world in many respects. and there are limited opportunities to engage with those other parties within an Antarctic context, and that has been done traditionally through the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting. So I guess that's the way that we need to engage with those nations and push forward that biosecurity and non-native species work.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much. Final set of questions now from James.
Before I forget, there is a new forum which will be happening on the 2nd and 3rd of December this year, which is the Conference of Antarctic Parliamentarians, first ever time is occurring in London in and around Parliament. I think that would be a very good opportunity to do precisely the kind of thing that... Incidentally, I think we should also... You're too modest to say it. Adam McMorrin's father was a scientist with British Antarctic Survey and spent 3, I think, seasons, remember rightly?
3 years.
3 years, including overwintering on the ice. So, and has a glacier named after him in Antarctica. So,
yeah, that was in the... Thank you, James. That was in the 1960s. So that a lot has moved on from there. So, and he was there consecutively without going back, of course, then.
Can I also just declare an interest, which is that this time last year I was lucky enough to be flown down to the Falklands, largely by the Falkland government, partly paid for by the all-party parliamentary group for the polar regions, of which I'm the chairman, and then was lucky enough to do the trip on the MV Pharos round the South Georgia, paid for by the commissioner, as he's called, and great it was too. And incidentally, the biodiversity controls, which I experienced then, were just superb. The zips on your anoraks were checked for seeds, and just amazing. Anyhow, I want to focus, if I may, on South Georgia. It was a hugely successful operation, both eradicating the reindeer, which I seem to remember was tens of thousands, if I remember rightly. 7,000. And then, of course, the rats, both enormously successful. 2 questions about it, really. First, to what degree could that experience be replicated elsewhere? Item 1, to which I suspect your answer may well be only to a very limited degree. And secondly, it was privately funded, and therefore is there an argument that says it should have been funded by some other means?
Yeah, I think going to your second question first, I think certainly the majority of the rat eradication and mice, actually it was rats and mice, was privately funded, but a lot of the infrastructure support for that project was funded through the government, and obviously the ongoing monitoring and biosecurity is paid for largely through the government, whereas the reindeer eradication was wholly paid for by South Georgia government. I think different islands with rodent infestations pose different problems. I think one of the problems that you have with aerial baiting is always going to be the risk of sort of collateral damage and poisoning to native species, and that risk has to be managed. Similarly with the reindeer program, that was, I suppose, relatively straightforward in that reindeer are much larger, and they were shot. They weren't poisoned. But ensuring an island like South Georgia, we were very lucky at the time in that different populations of rats were separated by glaciers, and therefore it could be a phased baiting program. That luxury doesn't exist on many islands that are either not glaciated or where glaciers are retreating. So you would have to probably do it all within one season for it to be effective, and that clearly is going to depend on the size of the island that you're wishing to de-rat. So I think there are, it was amazingly successful, and about this time last year the island was declared rat-free, and I think at the time it was the largest island globally to be announced rat-free, and already the consequences of that, seeing the return of the South Georgia pipit in particular around Grytviken, where it hadn't been for probably 100 years, but equally some of the duck species, and no doubt a lot of the smaller seabirds as well are recovering in great numbers. So hugely successful. I think there are lessons that can be learnt from other OTs, but not necessarily directly applicable.
Sorry, just one detailed matter. Fur seals are now in huge overpopulation, aren't they, in and around the island? Is that a counterbalance to pest eradication, or could fur seals now be described as something of a pest?
Fur seal numbers are probably at historical highs, having been almost wiped out to about 200 individuals about 200 years ago. But then there's been a succession of removal of top predators. So then there was 100 years of whaling. The response from the fur seals is likely to have been a response to a lack of competition for Antarctic krill, So their numbers slowly have recovered, and then over the last 30 years are now probably around about 5 million individuals. But whales, as I'm hearing all the time from my vast colleagues and from other research in the region, are making a comeback. Humpback whales in particular this year, and some of the other fin whale species are returning in significant numbers. So there could be a rebalancing of the whole ecosystem, and I think it's something we need to be aware of when these eradication programs are undertaken. There's going to be probably a very large increase in the number of some of the seabirds at South Georgia, and that is likely to have consequences further down the line to a sort of rebalancing of the ecosystem, hopefully to return somewhere to where it was pre-man's engagement on the island 200 years ago.
Okay, briefly, just talk us through how we can stop them coming back. I mentioned briefly the biosecurity that I myself saw on the Faros, but I mean, what other steps can we take?
Well, we're very fortunate in that we have a whole series of detection points around the island that are monitored regularly to look for any sign of rodent activity, so gnaw sticks. But as I mentioned earlier on, one of the most important things is that these measures are carried out before vessels enter into South Georgia waters. So there are very strict biosecurity regulations on tourist vessels and fishing vessels. But one of the most interesting developments, as I think was mentioned earlier on, has been this detector dog program based in the Falkland Islands that is now insisting, as far as possible, that vessels entering into the South Georgia Maritime Zone undergo a thorough rodent detector dog inspection in Port Stanley prior to entering South Georgia waters. And we're at the point where these are dogs that are American trained and American owned at this point. I think through Detector Dogs for Conservation, I think is the name of the firm. But we're in the process of training up our own dog to be based in the Falkland Islands with a South Georgia government employee that will be in charge of that program.
Okay, so it's a bit specialist, but it could be replicated, for example, in Biot, where there's big black rat problems, isn't there?
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with the logistics of Biot, but I certainly would say that this is a type of program that could be replicated elsewhere in the world.
Some places, yeah.
So the RCB is working in partnership with the Tristan da Cunha government on what we think will be the sort of the next big aerial rodent eradication to follow South Georgia, and that's on the World Heritage Site of Gough Island in the Tristan da Cunha group to eradicate introduced mice, which are driving the Tristan albatross and the Gough bunting to extinction. So we have had very good liaising with all the operators over at South Georgia and certainly sharing knowledge. If I can just pick up on that funding question. This Gough World Heritage Site restoration is scheduled for next year at a cost of about £9 million, of which we've raised 6 million so far, and of which 2.4 million has been a very generous contribution from DEFRA. I think the private funding question is very interesting. South Georgia, to our mind, has the advantage of 10 to 15,000 tourists a year, whereas Gough is actually not open to tourists. It's sort of kept as a pristine sanctuary, and there's only 10 ships a year visit the Tristan da Cunha group, and so basically there's zero tourists, and we don't have that same exposure to sort of wealthy individuals, and actually raising attention to the plight of what is a UK responsibility as a World Heritage Site, but is an island that people aren't able to visit, we've found very difficult. So we are committed to trying to raise the majority of funding from private sources, but are calling on a 40% contribution from the UK government as a means of saving what are now the only two remaining critically endangered bird species anywhere on UK territory.
Okay, funding is one thing, but practicality is the other. And the point it's making really with regard to South Georgia is, in a sort of way, expensive but quite doable, partly helped by the glaciers and all that. Can I ask you to focus on one other invasive species which might be less doable, or can you talk us through other species, particularly lionfish? Could you do something similar? I mean, obviously not similar, underground as a fish, not a rat, as it were, but nonetheless, is there a way in which you could eradicate lionfish in the way that the South Georgia Heritage Trust eradicated the rats and mice in South Georgia?
I think the previous evidence session focused on lionfish a lot, didn't it, as a case study of what can happen when an invasive species is out of control. I think the general consensus in the Caribbean is that management is now the only option and eradication seems very unlikely. It's quite disappointing to hear that it's actually sort of spreading this way. I was quite surprised to hear that, you know, it's been found in Cyprus and the Azores. I remember back in 2014 there was an idea of maybe looking for life funding for a big project in the Caribbean, but it had to meet the requirements of life in terms of that it would impact other member states. And now, looking 5 years later, we're actually seeing that probably is going to impact on many other member states that don't have overseas territories. So that maybe have been an opportunity missed in terms of the lionfish spreading back to where it came from. So yeah, I think in terms of ongoing management of the lionfish, we're actually seeing quite a lot of research in our overseas territories as well into, you know, very interesting insights into its behaviour, which may also help with management of it. But ongoing management of invasive species isn't necessarily something that project funding is akin to, because it has to have projects tend to have a 2 to 3 year phase, but actually with the lionfish that's probably going to be impractical. So,
okay, final question on fishing, if I may, particularly with Dr. Belcher. There was a proposal last year to abolish all fisheries off the South Sandwich Islands. If that had gone ahead rather than the conclusion we did come to, what consequence would that have had for biodiversity in the South Atlantic or in the Antarctic Ocean?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. The proposal from a group of NGOs to close the South Sandwich Islands was more of a concern, I suppose, about future activity, because there is no krill fishing within South Sandwich Islands waters, and there was minimal fishing back in 1994. Our real concern as a government, and more broadly within the Antarctic community, was that there is currently a quota set for krill for that area, that some other fishing nations from within the Antarctic Treaty System could argue that if the quota is removed from one area, it could actually be taken in areas that are more sensitive on the Antarctic Peninsula. So we have a very strict, tightly managed, environmentally managed krill fishery within South Georgia waters, but currently no activity in the South Sandwich Islands. So our concern was what the knock-on effects might have been had that closure taken place.
Thank you.
Oh. It's laying to rest some leftover business from a previous report, which the committee debated at great length, but we won't go into that now. Can I thank our 4 guests for a very interesting and illuminating session, and we are going to take a brief 2-minute break while we have the panel changeover. Order. Order, order. We're quite short of time, so I'm going to start and begin by welcoming our second panel of witnesses, who I saw a few of you sitting, listening through panel one. So I wondered if you could begin, as we did last time, by introducing yourself, starting from my left with Rob Quest. Microphone.
Rob Quest, City of London Corporation. I'm based at Heathrow Airport, where we operate the border inspection post.
No pressure there then. Microphone off. Thank you.
And Wayne Grills, Chief Executive of the British Association of Landscape Industries, so trade association for landscape contractors, garden designers and suppliers to the industry.
Good morning, my name is Tracy King and I'm the Assistant Chief Executive at the Ornamental Aquatic Trade Association based in Wiltshire.
Hi, I'm David Aldridge. I head the Aquatic Ecology Group at the Department of Zoology here at Cambridge University, where I do a lot of work on invasive species, particularly in freshwater systems. I'm also a fellow at St Catherine's College and very much involved in the BioRisk project.
And you've been very helpful along with Professor Bill Sutherland in organising today. So thank you very much indeed, Dr. Aldridge. Perhaps I can start with a question to you. How well do you think the UK government is doing in terms of regulating these key pathways of invasive species?
Thank you. I'll talk by example of looking at fresh waters, because that's what I perhaps know the most about. In fact, if we look at non-native species establishing in the UK's freshwaters, we can see that every decade we get increasingly more and more species establishing. And in fact, if we look at our biota in the UK, it's quite remarkable that over 10% of our plants in our freshwaters are non-native, over half are amphibians, and in fact, all our decapod crustaceans, all 10 species, are non-native. Even our so-called native crayfish is actually non-native.
What's a decapod crustacean?
Oh, sorry. So
you got to speak normal when you're talking to us. We're amateurs.
A crayfish or a crab. And so even
Ray hears about the crayfish.
Yeah. So we're seeing big increase in all these species. So at the face of it, you might say we're not managing these pathways very well. But if you drill down and you start to look at what pathways are actually bringing these things in, we start to see that we've got very good at controlling certain pathways. So, for instance, now nothing is really coming through the introduction for sport or for aquaculture, but the big drivers are really the ornamental trade and contaminants, and so these are things which are carried across perhaps primarily through international water sports events. And so if we look at the two major invaders that have established in the UK in the last 5 or so years, or 5 or 10 years, then the killer shrimp arrived in Grafham Water in 2010. The quagga mussel arrived in Raisbury Reservoir in 2014, and these species have subsequently spread to other reservoirs, sometimes quite separated by long distances. And so it's very likely that the major pathways here are either water sports events or angling. And so as far as managing those pathways, we're not particularly good still. We're not really managing them. There are some other pathways we've started to detect. We've come across a bit of an unexpected one recently, which I probably can't go into great detail on, but we have some pretty compelling evidence that the military might be playing a part in introducing invasive species into the UK. And I think this is something which might be worthy of more careful looking at, because the military may do operations overseas and not necessarily employ the same strict levels of biosecurity that some of the rest of us are perhaps employing.
Let's press you on that then. What are they bringing back? Is it seeds, plants, water things?
So the particular example we have is quite a major water invader, which the genetic data that we have indicates that the most likely pathway is through some military activity.
We're about to do a National Audit Office inquiry into the MOD, so we might get them. They do environmental audits for us, so we might get them to have a look at that in particular as they go through and do that work. Thank you.
Okay, that would be good. I mean, the other important issue that we are concerned about is not just introductions into the UK, but also then transport across UK water bodies. And at the moment, we're looking in the UK at a large number of interbasin water transfers in response to increasing populations and managing climate change. And we don't really know how effective any measures are in stopping things getting transported from what were once isolated water bodies into other systems. So I think we're making some progress at managing pathways, but there's still quite a lot to do.
Ask Mr. Grills and then Dr. King about what you are doing in terms of your industry, and about what your industries are doing to try and stop these alien invaders coming in, because DEFRA's list said that the 8 unintentional pathways were horticultural escapes, contaminants, etc., and stowaways. So what steps is your industry taking?
Okay, so maybe if I start and give you a feel for the size of the ornamental horticulture industry. So we're now not talking about food production, we're talking purely ornamental horticulture. The industry last year convened a research report which was undertaken by Oxford Economics, which gave us an industry economic size of £24.2 billion contribution to GDP, with about £5.4 billion of tax revenue to government, and that also highlighted, as well as the 578,000 people employed in the industry, highlighted that there was also £1.2 billion of imports on plants. So that's the kind of size of what we're dealing with purely in the ornamental horticulture sector. I think as a trade association and with our membership, and we have to bear in mind, of course, that we're talking to part of the industry, but I know that there are many other associations, bodies, etc. in the industry are doing similar work to ourselves. So we sit on a number of government working groups that DEFRA have set up, such as the Tree Health Policy Group, the Oak Processionary Moth Working Group. We sit on the steering group that His Royal Highness Prince Charles established for plant health and biosecurity, and a number of others as well. So in terms of our membership, our registered members, those that are wanting to do a good job, we are certainly pushing information out with regards to plant health biosecurity. There's been a plant health standard which has now been achieved, which has now been publicised, and on the back of that, the Horticultural Trades Association, in fact, are the leaders on the work that are taking place to develop a plant health assurance scheme.
Why has it taken you so long? I mean, this stuff's been coming in for decades. If I go to my local supermarket or my local garden centre, I have no idea whether this is great, whether they're the good guys, the bad guys, or the indifferent people. So why are you only now developing a standard?
I think, well, there's been a number of standards, I think, across the industry, but it's about trying to find a common standard.
What are those standards?
Well, there's a whole range of standards that have been used, but for different parts of the industry, different sectors within the industry. And I think now what we're looking for
are
is
those standards? What are they called?
They don't spring to my mind, unfortunately.
Okay, so you can't tell us what they are. So how is the consumer meant to know when
Absolutely.
they're buying something?
Well,
You're the industry representative, aren't you?
We are for landscape contractors and garden designers, not for necessarily the growers particularly. We've got growers in our membership, but it's not our main base. But I think exactly that.
So when the council comes to you and says, we'd like these X trees for these streets,
yep.
How do they know if they're where they've come from? If they're, we had the ash dieback 7 years ago.
Yep.
Woodland Trust planted them. What have you done as a result of ash dieback, for example?
Well, of course, a lot of that is down to the likes of DEFRA with the Animal Plant Health Agency and their inspectors coming in. So they're inspecting nurseries.
Asking what you've done in your growers to stop importing diseased plants. It's not the role of government to check on you. What checks is the industry undertaking?
So I think where I'm coming from, sorry, maybe I'm not making this clear enough. I think where I'm coming from is that the growers that are in our membership, and likewise for the landscape contractors, etc., it's more about awareness about what they're looking for. So I think this is where we've been pushing information out. There is a greater level of information now with regards to pests and diseases, plant health, etc., than there's ever been before. So I think a lot of that is about awareness. And certainly from our point of view, I think one of the largest risks that we face is from a general public point of view, the consumer point of view, not understanding those, which I think you've just referred to. And I think what we're looking at developing as an industry moving forward in consultation with government is a plant health standard that would be recognisable. So, for example, something that would equate itself to the Red Tractor scheme or the Red Lion scheme for eggs, etc., so that people could recognise that there is a stamp on those plants and they know that it's been sourced sustainably and healthily.
Did any of your landscape contractors, were any of them caught up in ash dieback? Did any of them purchase trees that were diseased?
Not at the time, no.
So subsequently, yes.
Sorry, at the time it was a real issue when it first was established. No.
So your people knew what to look out for through the information you provided. Great, thank you. Can I move on to Dr. King?
Thank you. The Ornamental Aquatic Trade Association and the industry which we represent takes our responsibility extremely seriously. To import live ornamental fish, an importer has to be authorised, and it comes under the Import of Live Fish Act. And that authorisation comes from the Fish Health Inspectorate, who we work with very closely. And there is a permissive list of fish species which are allowed to enter the UK for ornamental purposes.
When did that act come into force?
It came into force in 1980, I believe.
Okay, so it's like 40 years old. Has the list of fish been updated since then?
It has been updated on the Fish Health Inspectorate look at that list. My understanding is they look at that list on a regular basis. We also, in relation, if I can just come back to a point about ornamental crayfish, there is only one species which is allowed entry into England and Wales, and that is a tropical species, the common name of which is the red claw. I can give you its scientific name, which is Cherex quadricarinatus. But in terms of Scotland and Northern Ireland, my understanding is that there are no ornamental crayfish allowed in trade. In relation to aquatic plants, any coming in and import into the UK are required to carry a phytosanitary certificate and undergo checks. In relation to what we as an industry are doing, we come at it from two pathways. It's about educating our industry and educating our end users. In terms of educating our industry, we need to empower them with the information that they can need to initiate conversations with the customers so that they can empower those customers to make the best decisions and take their responsibilities. So in that respect, we have produced a biosecurity guidance document. As part of that document, it has a biosecurity audit checklist, which covers invasive species. We also have recently launched industry-specific training. The issue of invasive non-native species is one which contains complex terminology, and it's something that some of that terminology doesn't translate very well into everyday language. So a person may have heard of the term biodiversity, but they may not have a clear point of reference as to what it actually refers to. And so the analogy that we give is to think of biodiversity as a patchwork quilt. And the impact that invasive non-native species has is to take that patchwork quilt and turn it into a uniform blanket, destroying the species' richness and abundance. But it's in a way that they have a clear point of reference that they can refer to their customers. Our members also have a number of initiatives. They carry the no-release message, warning their customers not to release ornamental fish or aquatic plants into the wild. That is carried on their own inline products. It's on their care sheets. It's on our care sheets. It's on fish transportation bags. It's on plant labels. It's on social media presence. It's on till receipts. In terms of people buying a new pet, their outreach is in the region of about 8.5 million people. We also take part, we also are keen supporters of the Be Plantwise campaign, and we also, we're keen supporters of the Be Plantwise campaign, and we also work with our colleague trade associations we have also various initiatives globally to raise this important issue.
In terms of if I go and buy a red crayfish, I don't know what a red crayfish looks like or how big it gets, but if it gets massive, or some other fish that goes and eats all my other fish, and I think, oh, that's not very nice, and I just flush it down the loo, we've not really got any control over what happens to that fish once it's gone out into the drains, or, you know, have we? We don't really know what happens. That could be a route.
Potentially, but it's highly improbable. The reason being that the tap water is treated with chemicals to make it safe for us to drink in. Those chemicals, such as chlorine and chloramine, are highly toxic to fish. If it was to enter the tap water, it is likely those chemicals would kill the fish. If that doesn't kill the fish, it's probably the physical trauma of being flushed down the toilet. If it makes it as far as the sewage system, again, it's going to encounter a range of chemicals which are highly likely to kill that fish.
If I felt sorry for my crayfish and took it to the local reservoir, that's a different story.
It is a different story, yes, and that's about promoting the No Release campaign, and it's about making people aware of the consequences of their actions.
Thank you very much indeed. Methods of dispatching fish having now been covered. We'll move on to Heathrow. Can I just ask you, Mr. Quest, how does the City of London Corporation assess the pathways and prevent invasive species for the people that aren't members of these trade associations, for the cowboys, for the illegal wildlife trade? What are you doing at Heathrow?
Animals being imported by air are legally are very controlled. So 100% of those consignments must go through a border inspection post. And we work very closely with APHA, CFAS, Fish Health Inspectorate.
Can you just spell out all those things, please?
CFAS is the Centre for Environment, Fisheries and Agricultural Science, who run the Fish Health Inspectorate based in Weymouth. APHA is the Animal and Plant Health Agency, who are in the same location as us at the border inspection post, and also with Border Force. So the consignments that we know are coming in, like I say, 100% have to come to the border inspection post. Part of our role is to open those consignments and check what's in there to make sure they're the right species. We do that again with the Animal and Plant Health Agency vets, and also when they're with us, the Fish Health Inspectorate, and also the Plant Health Inspectorate come over to us to look at aquatic plants. So if it's part of the legal trade, it is quite well regulated, inspected. Where things come through unknown, I should say, that's down to Border Force, and they will pick those up either on a passenger, sometimes in other cargo, and then they will be brought to us. So that's an illegal route, so you're talking about illegal wildlife trade. Sometimes within legal consignments, we get things that aren't supposed to be there, and that's where, if it's in the aquatics, Fish Health Inspectorates come into play. Border Force also will deal with CITES specimens that are misdescribed, for instance. But our role is identifying, so if we got a shipment of, say, reptiles from the States and there's some red-eared sliders in there, which are one of the species you can't import, they're on CITES as well as the invasive species list, we would notify Border Force and that would be taken out.
What's the worst thing you've ever found then?
Worst thing I've ever found? Difficult. I mean, recently, I think you'll probably come on to it later, is and you were talking about pathways. One of the difficult pathways we have is post. Some animals that come in get posted in. So the International Parcel Depot at Coventry are very good at finding these things, and they will send them down to us. You know, they should come through a border inspection post, so they send them down to us. So, for instance, we had 200 scorpions in the post recently. They were covered by CITES, so Border Force were involved in that case as well. So, you know, you open up a little brown parcel and out jump 200 scorpions. So
that's going to give us nightmares for for weeks to come. Thank you very much. We're going to move on with a question from Anna.
Thank you very much. Just following on from Mary's question, really, can I ask a question about stowaways? Because we know that transportation of stowaways is quite a common way to get invasive species, non-native species, into the country. And we heard in a previous session, for example, from the RSPB, that it's not just plants, it could be flatworms, for example, hidden in soil, and that actually turn out to be predators from New Zealand, that actually turn out to be predators of earthworms. So what are you doing as the City of London to look at the specific incidents of stowaways, of all manner of incidents?
Because we're where we are and the airport community know us well, anyone working on the airport, if they find anything, they bring it to us, which works quite well. And I would say at any time you pay us a visit, we will have stowaways on site. I would say most of the time they wouldn't be invasives, but geckos, someone mentioned geckos in the previous panel, so they're quite commonly stowaways. Spiders, cockroaches. There's a discussion previously about ants. We've had ant colonies come in with reptile boxes, black widows in boxes with dogs in from Australia. So I would say stowaways for us is quite a common occurrence. We see quite a lot of animals coming in that way. Frogs as well. So yeah.
So basically, it's just an informal approach to keeping an eye out.
It is, yeah. I mean, one of the things the number of black widows we had coming in increased substantially when we went to organic grapes coming in from California, because previously they would spray them with insecticide. We wouldn't have any stowaways on them, but as soon as they start bringing in organic food, all those invertebrates survive. So we're getting people bringing over black widows from the grapes.
Wow. Okay.
Going back to the pesticide ones. Then.
Yeah. So can I turn then to Dr. Tracy King initially? So what developments do you think in technology traceability could be done to improve border checks, so to ensure that stowaways are found as they're coming through?
In terms of the current requirements for the importation of live fish and aquatic plants, in relation to live fish, if they have to be accompanied by an animal health certificate and a document known as the Common Veterinary Entry Document. So they have to have been inspected, and when they arrive at a border inspection post, a percentage of that consignment will be checked. I believe in relation to aquatic plants, and Rob may be able to confirm this, aquatic plants are subject to a 100% check on each consignment. Is that correct?
Plants aren't my forte.
But there is an issue in knowing what the trade flows and trade patterns are. That is something difficult, because when they come in, they will typically come in as a restricted number of commodity codes. So in relation to ornamental fish, you can only categorise them down as far as, are they freshwater, are they marine? In relation to plants, it's even less of a categorisation. You can take it down to, are they outdoor, are they indoor? No further differentiation is possible. In that regard, we have been looking at technological solutions, and one of those is a piece of software which is being developed in the USA. It's been developed by Dr. Andrew Ryan and Dr. Michael Talusty, and it's a species data extraction tool which takes information from a scanned packing invoice, and it can look for certain names, it can look for certain patterns, it can look for trends, it can detect what species are coming in, it can detect if it's an anomaly, so it could detect if it's a CITES listed species or if it is a banned species. It can give data on the volumes that are coming in and the trends and patterns.
Thank you. But in terms of stowaways, though, so this wouldn't be a declared. This would be, something hiding in the midst. So, what sort of technology would be needed to be able to find a stowaway?
In terms of ornamental fish, they have to be checked for diseases prior to export, and then they're checked again on import. In relation to aquatic plants, there is a move towards production methods. It's called clean plants, and it's basically the production of aquatic plants. It's tissue cell culturing, so they're grown and propagated under laboratory conditions, so that they are free of stowaways and contaminants. That's something that the industry is starting to go more towards, is my understanding.
Okay, thank you very much. So can I ask, or anyone who'd like to answer this question, so would the UK benefit from a dedicated inspectorate then for invasive species, looking at biosecurity, prevention, stowaways? Yeah.
Yeah, so I read your previous report where that was recommended. Before you go down that route, I would say you need to assess the scale of the problem and the scope and where its remit would be. Because I think within the other agencies already in place, you have a lot of expertise in this area, from the MMO, the Marine Management Organisation, through Plant Health Agency, Fish Health Inspectorate, Plant Health Inspectorate, Natural England. They all have their expertise in parts of the issue. So whether it's worth setting up something separate or even having a task force made up from experts from those organisations already. But I do think you need to map out the scale and the scope before you would look at setting up something separate.
Would anybody else like to comment on that?
I would share Rob's concerns about what the actual remit of such an inspector would be, and of course there would need to be concordance with the other agencies. One thing we do experience is that these agencies have no clear line of communication with each other. So it would also, such an inspectorate would need to work with the National Wildlife Crime Unit, and there would need to be a clear remit as to what their role would be. If it's in terms of enforcement, it's easier to enforce a bricks and mortar premises because it's a physical premises, you can go and visit it. But an increasing pathway is the issue of e-commerce. A lot of the businesses selling on e-commerce are not registered businesses, they are just private sellers, and some of them are based outside of the UK. If their remit is e-commerce, then that is basically all they will be doing. And then there's the issue of how it will be funded. Assuming that they will be seeking full cost recovery, some of that cost recovery will come from industry. And we're already being hit by charges, the substantial charges to legally and legitimately import something into the UK.
Thank you. We'll move on with on some Brexit questions now from James.
Can I ask a couple of domestic questions first of all? First of all, why is, Mr. Quest, the City of London doing this?
Good question. The City of London has a legal duty to enforce the animal health and welfare legislation for the whole of the Greater London area, and that's why we're at Heathrow, because that falls within Greater London. So as well as what we do there, operating the border inspection post, any illegal imports found within Greater London, we have to deal with those as well. Currently, that's mostly puppies and kittens and things like that, but that's our legal statutory duty.
But it does slightly reconfirm Ms. McMorrin's question that, I mean, if it's the City of London one moment, Natural England the next moment, it's the animal health people the next moment, it's the fisheries people the next moment, it's the environmental how's your file the next moment. I mean, you know, is there not some argument in favour of saying let's have an organisation whose responsibility it is to stop invasive species coming into the UK? I mean, it's a historic anomaly that the City of London are doing it. It seems a bit odd to me.
Well, we're doing part of it, as you say. There's a lot of organisations doing different parts of it in different parts of the country and in different areas. And it is such a wide thing. If you're looking at plant diseases 1 minute, live animals another minute, it is a very, very broad scope. So it's whether you have one agency which would have to work UK-wide at the border, and you've already got people at the border. So I think it just needs a bit of work as to whether it would be worthwhile or whether you can use the expertise already in those organisations.
Further domestic question to Dr. King. You mentioned your organisation is based in Wiltshire. Where?
We're based in Westbury, I nearly forgot then,
Westbury.
and we're in Westbury.
And where do you personally live?
Sorry?
And where do you personally live?
I live near Melksham in Wiltshire.
Whereabouts near Melksham?
A canvassing session, James.
But so do I. That's why. But that means you're not a constituent of mine. Therefore, I can be as rude to you as I like. That's fine.
You're not going to be,
James. I'm not going to be. All right. At the moment, Traces, the EU organisation, is the body that lays down the rules and regulations for these things. And of course, when we leave on the 31st of October this year, that will no longer apply. So, to what degree will changes in trade patterns thereafter affect the way that we handle these matters? Well, I guess Dr. King maybe, or Dr. Aldridge.
Dr. Aldridge, you've been quiet
Okay,
for a while.
I'll offer you a view on changing trade, because we know that that trade patterns historically have been fantastic predictors of invasion pathways. So if we look at the UK and freshwater invasives, before we joined the EEC in 1973, the UK detected 44% of non-native species before any other European country. But then in the last 25 years, since we've traded more directly with mainland Europe, in fact, 88% of the invasive species that we've received in the UK were first detected in mainland Europe. And in fact, we can actually quite reliably predict what the next invaders are by watching them spread across Europe towards the UK. And there's about a 4-year lag before we detect them in the UK. So at the moment, we have a very powerful tool by working with partners in the European Union to see what's coming next and to start to prepare for things. Now, if we change our trade patterns, which might happen under a Brexit scenario, then we could actually switch in the UK from being a broad-scale recipient of invasives to becoming a country which is actually a primary donor region. And so that actually has quite a lot of implications for how we deal with invasive non-native species. Because firstly, we may not know what's coming next, and therefore we can't prepare very well. We won't necessarily know if something arrives what it is. It may not have an invasion history, and so we need to have a look at what its ecological impacts might be, what its economic and societal impacts may be. And because we can't learn from our European neighbours, we may not know what tools are available for even managing or trying to eradicate these species. And I think also if we become...
Before you go on, can I just interrupt you there one moment? Let's imagine we have left, let's imagine Tracy's no longer applies. Why will that prevent us speaking to the European Union about their experience? And if indeed you're right in saying these things are taking 4 years to trudge across the mainland of Europe before they get to us, well, presumably Tracy's therefore isn't working all that well, but at all events, even though we're an independent nation state, we'll presumably still be talking to the EU in the way that we do to America or Japan or anywhere else.
I think the primary issue is that at the moment we're seeing stuff coming across from Europe, but if we trade more directly with countries, particularly we're concerned about South America and Asia, then we might get a lot of these organisms first, and therefore we might have actually a much greater responsibility to our European partners to be dealing with these problems.
Okay, so we need to set up something similar in the UK to the regime that currently exists surrounding the EU, is basically what you're saying. Is that correct?
I think so. I mean, we do have a big advantage that we are an island nation, and therefore, unlike, for instance, if you're in the Netherlands, the Rhine has gone through 7 countries before it comes to you, so you take whatever everyone else has dumped into the river. We have some better opportunities for control over our borders, and so I think we should be looking at other systems. I think we could probably learn quite a lot from looking at what happens in New Zealand and Australia.
Okay, and to what degree do you know that the government are already doing that, perhaps in the no-deal planning or in general? I mean, they presumably have thought of this, and they presumably are making plans as to what we're going to do when we leave.
I presume so.
We don't know.
Mr. Quest, why don't you talk to us about the UK's Traces system, which we've spent £5 million
Yeah, so
on?
Traces is this EU database, and it does hold a lot of intelligence of movements of animals and goods. But DEFRA has set up a similar system called IPAPS, and please don't ask me to say what IPAPS stands for, because I can't remember. But the Import of Products and Animals, FFS. Sorry? Yes, it's a copy of Traces. So when we do leave, we will have a similar system in place. But it will take time for that system to build up the intelligence that we currently have within Traces.
You'd accept my point that we will presumably continue to talk to the European Union. We're not actually going to cut the telephone lines, and we can make use of their intelligence, and they presumably will make use of our intelligence,
yes,
even though we're no longer a member.
Yeah, I would say that would be right.
So broadly speaking, I think what you're saying is no particular effect, really. I mean, of course, there are things that have to be done. We have to do set up our own systems. But by and large, we would hope that the biosecurity in the UK would be similar or perhaps even better after we leave the European Union.
Always opportunities. But going back to the Traces and the IPAPS thing, it's maintaining that links to the intelligence that is already in that system, which we would need to keep, I think.
Just press you on that. Traces is a single market mechanism, so we only get access to Traces if we stay in the single market. Otherwise, is it paying a fee, or is it, how does it work? Do we know?
I'm not sure how it works, but from where I sit as a sort of a regulator, it would be important to keep access to that intelligence somehow.
Yes, I just sort of to maybe pick up on a few of the other risks associated with not having direct opportunities to engage with the European Union. Yes, we can still talk, but we can't necessarily influence in the way that we do at the moment. And actually, if you look at invasive species management across the European Union at the moment, a large part of the projects, the collaborative EU cost actions, for instance, are led and driven very predominantly by members of the UK. And that allows us to share information with partners and develop collective programmes for managing and predicting future invasives. And I think if we can't have the opportunities of access to funding and involvement in these projects, we have a real risk of actually losing an opportunity to help ask questions which are of direct relevance to the UK.
Yes, you may well say that, but we'll see. Yes, okay, yeah, understood. I'm sure it'll be fine. Don't worry about it. It's going to be all right. It's all going brilliantly well.
We are going to move on now very quickly with some questions from John.
I would like to move you on to public and stakeholder awareness, but for your information, just probably over some 60 years ago, I had no idea I was discovering invasive species in my hometown of Denny when we had a paper-making industry. And we used to get Esparta grass brought in by train. That would be before Dr. Beeching, of course. But we used to jump into the wagons looking for snakes. And sometimes you could actually find them. We just thought they were pretty harmless bits of fun. So thank God we've improved maybe a wee bit since then, or I wouldn't be here today. I certainly didn't think I'd be arriving in Cambridge to talk about invasive species. However, we've already spoken a wee bit on how the invasive species are affecting everybody, and basically about public awareness, and we spoke about the horticultural escapes, the stowaways and fishing boats, etc. But so for our audience here, and probably for the wider audience, including ourselves, could you explain what we could be doing to help prevent the spread of invasive species amongst ourselves? And I would quite like to hear from Dr. Aldridge on something he mentioned earlier on about even his own son's school. If you can make the connection that you spoke to me earlier on about Mr. Attenborough.
Oh. Yes, okay. Yes, I shall try and bring that into my answer then. One of the big schemes that has been put into place by the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat to manage the spread of invasives in the UK is the Check Clean Dry campaign. Mm-hmm. And this has been rolled out very broadly on quite a small budget, and it's been remarkably effective. It involves putting signage up around reservoirs, and it encourages users of water to check their kit, wash it down, and make sure that they're not going to spread non-native species around. And this was initiated in 2014 in response to the killer shrimp arrival, but it was intended to try and stop any non-native species spreading. But there are some problems with this process. It works to a certain extent, but it certainly doesn't stop everything. So there are some simple tweaks that could be done. There's evidence now that if we use hot water, for instance, but not at a level which can cause scalding, we can actually control a lot more invasive non-native species. But there are also problems associated with this scheme in actual implementation. So actually, one of the things that astonishes me at the moment is that there are often large international water sports events that happen in the UK where every boat that leaves the reservoir is washed down and then it's allowed to leave. But no care is taken to actually initiate any biosecurity when that boat enters the water. It's almost like it's being driven by policy rather than common sense. And so I think, having a better implementation of actually saying, let's look at biosecurity of what comes in as well as what goes out from a site would enhance things a lot. It's similarly, if I go to an angling lake, often they encourage people to disinfect their angling gear with, before they enter a lake to stop the introduction of things which might harm their fishery, but they don't encourage any disinfection when the kit goes off-site. So we just need a lot more tied-up thinking. In relation to your David Attenborough point, we were talking earlier about how individuals can really influence public perceptions. And indeed, we were talking about the role that David Attenborough has played in helping to push environmental issues. I think you were suggesting that it would be rather nice to have somebody to follow in his footsteps and help perhaps push the invasive species agenda.
Thanks very much for that. You know, the man is 93-year-old and he's badly needing to have somebody following in his footsteps. Quite where we get somebody with that profile, I have no idea. But I know our committee have spoken about it quite regularly. But the fact that your school has brought that up, and I think what you told me that your son won an award of having nominated him. So that public awareness is already with us. I think it's how do we get this out to everybody in a more general manner, because at the moment we seem to be talking very generally across the world, but it happens in your back doorstep. And I think Mary was quite right earlier on when she said, you know, you can talk about it won't flush down the toilet, it will be killed, but there are other invasive species, plants that have taken great hold, particularly giant knotweed, Japanese knotweed I should say. But you can take these things to reservoirs and lochs and canals and they will breed there. But people aren't aware of that. So the message is, how do we get this out into everybody's household, indeed schools and organisations? Maybe you Doctor.
Maybe move that on to Dr. King and Mr. Grills.
So I think from our perspective, I mean, we're also pushing messages out to the general public that we speak to. So we will, you know, attend as part of our promotion of our members, our HS shows, for example. So we'll certainly have information available and pinpoint to general public where they can seek further advice, certainly from our members. I think there is a greater campaign, however, and if I just give you a specific example, there was a British Airways flight coming in from Croatia. This was towards the back end of last year, which actually managed to give every single every passenger a sprig, an olive sprig, to take home with them. So that's the kind of thing that we were dealing with when we're talking about public awareness, is that, you know, I could understand if it was a Croatian flight, but a British Airways flight should be more aware, certainly, of the issues of bringing things like that into the country. I think the biggest issue that we see or hear of...
Can you just explain what the problem with that was? Are you saying that it should have been checked? What was wrong with the olive?
What we're saying is there is a potential for bringing pests and disease into the country, on the olives in particular. Particularly at the moment, as it's a woody plant, it's known that it can be a host for Xylella, which is a growing disease in Europe at the moment as it is. But I think from our perspective, it was about saying, you know, had there been checks? I don't think there had, as far as we're aware. We passed it over to Animal Plant Health Agency for them to follow up. So I think, you know, they would be, I'm sure, making British Airways aware of the issues potentially surrounding that. But I think overall...
Is the import of olive trees controlled at the moment? So if I go to my garden centre and buy from one of your members,
Yep.
Have they gone through any specific process in order to make sure that that plant is a healthy plant?
Generally speaking, yes, they will. They'll be going through checks both sides of the border, pre and post, and also, again, checks when they come onto the nursery. Now, there's a number of nurseries in the country at the moment that are then holding those plants for a period of time. Some are going up to 12 months on their incubation period, depending on the type of plant and what the host might be. But I think there is a bigger general issue here. I think what we hear generally is that most, you know, cuts of plants that have come in from overseas countries will probably come in through toiletry bags. You know, they're hidden that deep into luggage, etc. And that's where we potentially have the biggest issue. And I think going back to our earlier issue is, you know, certainly e-commerce, the online purchase, etc. If it's not controlled in the same way that nurseries that are doing the right thing are controlled, then that potentially produces a great risk for us as well.
Can I follow up on that? Because what kind of penalties are in place for people that are caught importing these things, like when, and I do mean unwittingly, i.e. the public?
Well, as far as I'm aware, I don't think there's any penalties for the public bringing them in, as far as I'm aware. The rest of the panel might have different information on that, but certainly in terms of importers, growers, etc., then obviously it's a risk to their own business, let alone any fines, etc., that they may have anyway. I think the outbreak of something on their nursery would certainly be a biggest risk. I think most nurseries and the size of them these days, it's more than likely to close a number of nurseries down to have that kind of risk on their nursery itself.
Yvonne, thank you very much. Dr. King, do you want to say, I mean, you've covered a little bit about what you've been doing. Do you want to say anything else about what you're doing to raise awareness amongst the public?
Thank you. Just briefly, I mean, we have a number of messages. So we put the no release message onto all of our cage sheets, and that's asking people not to release unwanted pets or unwanted fish or to dump aquatic plants into the wild. We make it clear that in relation to if somebody was considering releasing their unwanted fish into a pond or something, they may consider that to be an act of kindness. It's not an act of kindness. It's an act which is likely to cause cruelty and suffering to that animal. Part of the issue is that in terms of sales of invasive species which are banned, that there is no central portal for people to go to get the information about which species are prohibited from sale. And that is something we try to do in our training, but there does need to be a central portal for that. But we also carry messages. I mean, one of our recent messages is where we're asking people in England not to accept goldfish as prizes at fairs. It's a practice which is banned in Scotland, and we do not consider it acceptable. It is leading to a spontaneous purchase. If people are going to purchase an animal, a fish or a plant, buy from a reputable retailer, know what you are buying, make sure that the animals or plants' needs meet your expectations. If you're planting, plant with care. What goes into your aquarium, what goes into your pond, what goes into your garden stays there. But it's really the importance about the no release message and just getting people that they need to just stop and think of the consequence that their actions could have at the wild's expense.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And so a message to take back to the Scottish Government there for you, John. Just good to have a little bit of revenge there. Final question from Alex.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Aldrin, in your research, you've said that we may be on the brink of an invasional meltdown. So, considering that, how effective are methods such as horizon scans and risk assessments to take on that potential meltdown?
Thank you for reading my publications. Horizon scannings can be very effective, and there are techniques that have been developed now, particularly through Bill Sutherland's work, which allow consensus and prioritisation to be developed. And most recently in the UK, in 2014, we conducted a UK horizon scan of species we least wanted to establish in the UK. And we listed 30 priority species. And in the top 10, the first species that we selected was the quagga mussel, and within 6 months of publishing that paper, the quagga mussel arrived. And actually, since in the last 5 years, I think 8 of that top 10 have actually established in the UK. So that might show that we're very good at predicting future invaders, but it also probably shows that we're really rubbish at preventing them from establishing. So horizon scanning is good, but it's only good if we can then actually do something with that information. So what I think is the challenge is that when a non-native species does arrive in the UK, and it's been predicted through horizon scanning, we don't at the moment have a very clear mechanism for what we do in response to an early detection. I'll give you an example. We have a clam in a Lincolnshire ditch. It's called the Gulf wedge clam. And it was detected in 2015. It had no invasion history anywhere else in the world. It now occupies a 10-kilometre stretch of this river. It's nowhere else in the UK. We know that it's dominating the biomass. It's 90% of the biomass of the bottom of that river is this non-native species. We know it's driving ecological change, but we haven't done anything about it. We have a tool for killing this thing in this ditch. We could eradicate it from the UK. We have a low chance of it coming back, but nobody's doing anything about it. And I think this is the challenge we have, is that we're good at horizon scanning, and I think we should keep doing this, but nobody is really taking a lead on then acting on early discovery. And so I think that what we need is a more coherent approach to horizon scanning and implementation of actions.
Just two quick follow-ups on that point. One, do you think that climate change is accelerating the risks? And two, where does the buck stop? So that example you gave in Lincolnshire, whose responsibility is it?
So yes, climate change is definitely increasing the risks. Firstly, it can allow species to establish in the UK that might previously have not been able to. And also it can stress our ecosystems and therefore make them more vulnerable to the establishment of non-native species because our native biota are less able to resist the incoming organisms. And so certainly with this invasional meltdown, what we're seeing is that non-native species are interacting with each other and actually facilitating the establishment of one another. Often if they come from the same native range, they've co-evolved together, and so they help each other out in their invasions. Where does the buck stop? Well, I'll tell you, to control that climate, it would cost about, or to eradicate it would cost about £30,000. We're not talking about a lot of money, but time and time again, we see different stakeholders, different companies saying, you do something about it, you do something about it. And the problem is that when these things arrive early on, they're not necessarily causing an economic or an ecological problem. And we only tend to be reactive when the costs start to ramp up, and by that stage it's too late. And so really what we need to do is to horizon scan, prioritise which species we think are highest risk. We can do these clever bioclimatic models that predict where these things are going to establish, and we can project that under climate change scenarios. And then what we can do is we can put on top of that a natural capital framework. We can cost economically what that organism would cost to the UK economy if it was to establish across that entire range. We have all the tools to do that. Then we can say, okay, what's your cost benefit for dealing with this when it first arrives? We can even review, BioRisk is doing this, we're looking at the evidence base for different management interventions for major invasive species. So we can actually look at the databases we're collating and say, if this arrives, this management tool will work most effectively under this environmental scenario. So we've got all the information there. It's just a case of tying it together and saying that the cost-benefit balances for us to do an eradication here, or to maybe say, okay, well, we accept that this non-native is not going to be an invasive.
Obviously, nobody's heard of this mussel and aware of it, but however, everybody's heard about ash dieback, and it's got a very high level of public visibility and public concern. Mr. Grills, how's the industry helping to identify priority region species concerns so we don't have another threat like ash dieback?
I think this is some of the work that I was talking about earlier. So I think there's more collaborative work going on now within the industry than there's ever been before. I want to say across industry, that's all of the relevant associations, societies, institutions, etc. But very much more closely with the likes of DEFRA and APHA, etc., just to make sure that the work that we're doing is certainly factual, correct, and well informed, I think, from the work that the likes of DEFRA are doing. I think, we've now got, over 1,000 pests and diseases on the plant health risk register, with about 100 more each year coming in. So that's the kind of issue that we've got to deal with. So it's then identifying, and I think part of the issue with some of these things in terms of, and I agree with the horizon scanning, is that we've got to continue to do that. Some of these, for example, the example I gave earlier was Xylella. Xylella has an incubation period of up to 6 months. So actually those plants can look very healthy when they come through the borders, but actually very quickly get them into the ground. You know, some of these things that are being imported from Europe can be in the ground within 48 to 72 hours from ordering. So I think we, you know, from our perspective, what we're then looking at as part of this plant health assurance scheme is then having, even within our membership, so the landscape contractors who are receiving these plants that hopefully have been through all these checks already, then having what we might class as the equivalent to a first aider, so a plant health assurance person within each business that can then certainly be monitoring and maintaining that looking forward. But I think absolutely working more closely, the horizon scanning, the work that we're doing already across a wide range of pests and diseases and invasives, I think is absolutely necessary moving forward. I think there is an issue for DEFRA in terms of that. I know they've ramped up their inspectors by about 100, and I think there's a plan to bring on another 100 further down the line. That takes a bit of time, of course, to get them up to speed. The right people with the right qualifications. You know, as we've already heard today, there are specific organisations that have specialisms, and I think, you know, sometimes specialisms go certainly within the plant arena as well. So.
Dr. King, a good example of horizon scanning and a risk assessment was your own organisation's findings nearly 20 years ago that we should stop selling water fern, parrot's feather, floating pennywort, water primrose and Australian swamp stonecrop, and I have no idea what the last one is, but it took nearly 15 years from you identifying it until the government banned the sales in 2014. Now, 5 years on from that, is it likely that we would have a repeat of that with other species, or has the government improved its effectiveness?
In terms of the government listening to us, we have no formal gateway to government. We can raise concerns that we have with the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat or the Fish Health Inspectorate. We were an early adopter of voluntary controls, and we have been looking at agreements that the UK may want to look at. So, for example, the New Zealand Government Industry Agreement for Biodiversity Readiness and Response, or something like the Dutch Aquatic Plant Covenant, which is the Covenant Water Planting. But because there is a narrow range of engagement, industries such as ourselves are not invited to horizon scanning workshops. And our industry members have a breadth and depth of experience that should and could be tapped into, and it should be, because it would enable and enhance capacity building, and it would build on all of our respective organisations' strengths, because at the end of the day, we all have the same common goal. We want to protect biodiversity. But we really do need that formal gateway to government so we can get our concerns highlighted, because we do horizon scan, we do keep a lookout. If something comes on our radar, we want to report it, we will put in a voluntary control. But it's being compounded by a lack of enforcement, and it's also being compounded by e-commerce.
So obviously you want that to be put on a statutory footing, so you are statutorily invited to be involved in horizon scanning. Would you like to put any species on the record today? Because then the Minister obviously will see them when we get to question them.
I mean, at the moment, we are warning our industry because of the impacts of pan-European Union-wide bans and the impact it is having. There are those in the sector which are turning to aquarium plants to try and plug the gap, which has been left by banned species, which present no biosecurity risk to the UK. One of those things that they're doing is there is a species called Egeria densa, and that is an aquarium plant. It should only be used as an aquarium plant. And we are aware that there are some sellers who are promoting it for use in ponds. It should not be used for ponds, and we have made that very clear in our messaging. We do continually look, but I mean, that's a specific example I can give to you today.
Thank you.
Follow up from Anna.
Thank you. Yeah, just to quickly follow up on that, you don't have a direct pathway into the UK government. Coming from Cardiff and having set up its I don't know, it's the research into infection and parasites in ecological system. I don't know how you pronounce the cripes, is it? Cripes, yeah. Do you have a direct pathway into Welsh Government? Because, of course, that they work very closely, and I know the ministers work very closely with Cardiff University.
So I used to be a member of that research group, and I still have links to them. But in terms of formal engagement with the Welsh Government, no. We are on working groups, and we attend those working groups. But in terms of highlighting and getting our concerns listened to by government, we can informally do it through agencies such as DEFRA or the GB Non-Native Species Secretariat or the Fish Health Inspectorate. But in terms of a direct line, no, we don't have a direct line of engagement.
Okay, perhaps next time you could go to your next door neighbour constituency MP and raise your concerns directly with James Gray. Just a thought for the future.
And he would act immediately and very effectively on looking after you. Yeah.
Or you're
he alleges. He alleges. Right. Well, we've had a lot of food for thought today. I'm particularly struck by the Gulf wedge clam, and I want to know whether they're good to eat and whether or not there would be any interest from people to go out and actually dig them up with this tool and have one of the rarest clams in the UK. I'm sure that would do very well on some of the dining tables in the posher restaurants. But can I thank all of our witnesses from both panels, colleagues, committee staff who have helped us make the trip and got us all here in one piece and are now bracing themselves to herd the cats to go back to London. Can I thank our audience for coming here and being with us today? We are finishing slightly late, for which I can only apologise. But I hope you agree it's been a very interesting session. And once more, thanks to Lord Des Brown, Dr. David Aldridge, Professor Bill Sutherland and Sir Mark Welland for hosting us here today. Order, order.
And the government advisors are invited to the David Attenborough building for a very quick lunch and to meet some members of the Cambridge Conservation Initiative. So thank you.